So now the clock is ticking, and then they have this brief opportunity with the special sessions and are going to have all these negative, unexpected consequences that aren't even on the AI companies you're trying to regulate. Sometimes AI is defined so broadly in these bills, it's going to apply to things like search engines or spreadsheets or just any kind of software that you're using, even like Zoom or other technologies that just happen to use AI and automation. I think that's why you've seen it not advance in places like Connecticut and California even, that are deep blue states, but their business community is really highlighting the consequences.
Hello, welcome again to another episode of the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on my friend and someone who knows a lot about technology and AI and so much more, and it's none other than Jake Morabito. Jake, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks so much for having me on, Vance. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, me too. We've got a lot to talk about, and you're always right on the front lines of these things, so I'm looking forward to it. But before we get into it too much, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience, and then we'll jump right into it. So I'm joined today by Jake Morabito, a leader at the intersection of tech, telecom, energy, and policy. As a senior director of both the Communications and Technology Task Force and the Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force at ALEC, he's very busy, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council. He's working directly with state lawmakers to ensure that freedom, not federal micromanagement, drives the future of innovation. From AI and 5G to broadband expansion and smart cities, Jake helps advance free market policy frameworks that empower people, not bureaucrats. His past work with Representative Darrell Issa and software.org provides him with a rare inside and out view of how Congress and the states handle emerging technology and how they often get things wrong. We'll discuss how states can lead in AI, how to avoid California-style regulatory creep, and how conservative principles can shape a smarter, freer, and more prosperous digital economy. So, with all that great stuff going on, Jake, we've got a lot to talk about today. But before we get into a lot of the details about the policy front, I want the audience to know more about you. So let me go and ask you the first question I do all the guests. Why do you do what you do every day?
Thanks. That's a great question. And part of what I do and what I love so much about the work we do at ALEC is the work we do directly impacts everyday people and help. The goal is to empower states and make decisions closer to local communities that, grow jobs, expand opportunity. And a lot of that work's being done at the state level, especially in technology issues. I feel like I've been doing this for almost a decade at this point, and the attention was always on DC and Congress and the White House dictating what the technology policy is going to be. Well, we've seen, in that intervening time, Congress is pretty gridlocked on a lot of the major issues, especially when it comes to things like artificial intelligence or protecting children online. And therefore, that conversation has shifted over to the states where you can actually get things done. States have to come up with their own budget. There's a lot of things that they have to do that Congress doesn't have to do. And there's a lot of good work being done that respects limited governments, free markets, and federalism, which are ALEC's core principles. And ALEC as an organization, what we do is we bring together state legislators from across the country. We have about almost a quarter of all state legislators choose every year to become a member of ALEC and attend our conferences where we develop model legislation that provides a framework for if there's a good idea happening in a place like Texas or in Utah, then other states might want to take that inspiration and bring it to their own states. So at the end result, we have policymakers talking to each other and exchanging ideas, which is a really great thing to see.
It's fantastic. And, I've went to a lot of the meetings over the last decade plus, and it's always a pleasure to visit with you and others at ALEC and also all the members that are there too, whether they be lawmakers and policy folks or so forth. And there's always a great discussion that's out there. When was ALEC created?
Yeah, so I believe it was 1973. So
okay.
We just celebrated our 52nd ALEC annual meeting in Indianapolis. So we've been around a while, and the conversation has really evolved. And we have different flavors of conservatism and center right thinking. And a lot of times, the refrain was always, let markets ride everything, and government shouldn't have any role or a very minimal role. And now, some states are starting to reconsider some of that. Like, should the government have a more active role in driving technology innovation? And something that ALEC wants to point out is the way that the internet was founded in the United States with American innovation, and America remains the undeniable leader in technology policy. Especially, you look at areas like Europe, that they took a different approach and strictly regulated the technology. You only have a handful of companies. Spotify is a notable example of a European tech company, but most of them, are American companies and Chinese companies increasingly. And a lot of that is because of our regulatory environment here that allows market forces to do the work, and you don't have government bureaucrats micromanaging how and whether technology can be used. It's really individuals responding to the products, and businesses have to meet the needs and demands of consumers. And so those are the principles that ALEC is advocating for, is how can we support our American tech companies that are working to make work easier for Americans and American families, really improve quality of life. And that's the type of thing that you can expect from an ALEC meeting when it comes to technology issues.
Yeah, no, definitely. One of my good friends is Jonathan Williams, who has been there for a long time as well, is now president, I guess. And so it's just a fantastic group overall. Everyone should go check it out that's listening to this. I'll make sure to put it in the show notes, links and everything as well. I'm wondering, a little bit more about your background, Jake, for the audience, is that, you've worked across the tech policy world from Capitol Hill to ALEC and so forth. And I wonder what drew you to focus on innovation, emerging technology, and how did that shape your views on limited government and free markets?
Yes, well, I got my professional career started actually working for my hometown member of Congress, which is Darrell Issa from California. I'm a San Diego, Orange County, California native.
Yeah.
Came to D.C. to go and intern for him, and they ended up hiring me on full time in that office. So I really got to learn directly from him, and he is an amazing mentor and expert in these areas directly. He owned a business in California. He's the owner of several patents and other, works extensively on this issue. So by virtue of that office, he's the subcommittee chairman of the Judiciary subcommittee on courts, intellectual property, and the internet. So he tackles technology policy more from that courts, intellectual property, patent lens, which is really interesting because we're having that conversation again now with artificial intelligence and how intellectual property and copyright weighs in. But it was by that office I kind of got exposure to the technology issues, and I really found it fascinating again because it has a lot of different permutations and shifts over the years. Like back a decade ago, AI was just a very theoretical thing. We were talking about things like net neutrality and social media regulation and censorship online. And now all of a sudden generative AI is a thing. And now you can create, you and me, just a layperson can create short videos or, really elaborate pictures, just with one plain language prompt. And that would have been science fiction a decade ago. And now here we are. So it's amazing to see where it'll go in the next decade. And that's, again, why I'm so excited about this space. It's always growing, always changing. Again, very close to the people that are actually using these products to, in their business, again, make workflows easier, reduce some of the burdensome work, and really empower everyday workers to do higher value tasks and focus on their creativity.
Yeah, definitely. Were there certain, as an economist, I tend to have a lot of, economists on and everything else. I wonder for you, Jake, are there certain economists or books that helped get you on the line or the path of free markets and things of that nature, or even on the tech space? Are there certain books that you would recommend for the audience?
Yeah, so it might be a bit cliche for your listeners maybe, but Thomas Sowell's quote about there not being any solutions and only trade-offs, I think is very apt. There's no such thing as a silver bullet solution. There's going to be a trade-off one way or the other, and I think policymakers would do well to heed that. As far as books, there's a lot of interesting pieces going around. One that I've been reading lately is a slightly older book at this point, but Chip War by Chris Miller has to do with the semiconductor industry.
Yeah.
It's a good overview of kind of how that got developed and how that ended up all being exported to Taiwan in the first place. Some people might be wondering, why is TSMC, so vital to the semiconductor supply chain and not the United States? And now we're trying to recreate some of that by bringing some of that capacity back to places like Arizona. So that's exciting to see. Yeah. And then another book that's been really influential in the tech space is The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah.
Which, there's some contention about, some of the research that, and the statistics that he put together, but the underlying message that he talks about the future of technology and its impact on kids is something that is getting a lot of resonance. And one thing that I've noticed is there just seems to be a lot more awareness and attention to the issue. So I personally don't believe government should be the decision maker and the solution to replace parents.
Yeah.
But maybe this is, when I was first growing up, my parents just handed me a laptop when I was 8 years old, and that was the end of the supervision. I was out doing God knows what. But I feel like that's happening less and less, and parents are increasingly aware of the tools available on places like just at the device level when you're setting up the iPhone, or even on the individual apps. Like, even I was just playing my Nintendo Switch with my daughter. They have a parental controls setting in there. So people are using those tools more and more, and there's just more awareness. So, but those are just a couple books that I've been reading.
Yeah, I haven't read Chip War yet, and if you can't see him, you're not watching this. He has the book behind him as well.
Oh, I do, yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna have to go pick that up now. The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, of course, is something that I think everyone should read. And I've had my quibbles with him and some of the data and where things are pointing, and in particular the movement towards more government, instead of the parents. But I do think, to your point, that there's a lot of great information in there that's for parents, and to be more aware of what your kids are doing. And in fact, whenever I read the book, to be honest with you, I thought it was more about parents and not so much about government. Exactly. It seemed like politicians, though, chose what they wanted to in order to make certain policies and head in that direction. But yeah, I mean, I have two sons. One is 10, about to be 11, and one is 7. He'll be 8 soon. And, it's interesting, though, to your point about going through all these parental controls. There's tons of them now, and I have them on my own apps and everything else. And so I think that we should be more aware of how to parent in this digital age versus being scared about the future and about what's going on. And I want to get into a lot of that today about the policy front. I think that we've hit a lot on your great background there. But my first point I wanted to ask you about is AI. I think that's on a lot of people's minds right now. And, AI is all the rage, but also drawing heavy-handed proposals from Washington and state capitals across the country. So what's your take, though, Jake, about what states should be looking at when they approach AI policy without crushing innovation? To your point about Thomas Sowell, who I love, there's no solutions, only trade-offs. And so what should these policymakers be considering, not only about what's happening with AI, but what their approach should be on policy?
Excellent place to start. And so I always like to start this by, I mentioned before just in the past decades how tech has changed. Even in the past 3 years, the AI conversation has changed so much. ChatGPT was released to the public in November 2022, and that was kind of the catalyst of this new tech era about generative AI. But what was interesting about that is it was almost too late for state legislators to respond. So many of them in that winter time of year, they're pre-filing legislation already, or their legislatures move quickly. They move in a couple months' time. So people were kind of mid freak out about ChatGPT, and then we're just kind of in listening mode, seeing how it unfolded. You did see some pretty abrupt moves. Like, you had a lot of the school systems in places like New York or Los Angeles rush to ban ChatGPT and AI from schools. And then a lot of them had to quickly reverse course once they saw that it wasn't as bad as they might have anticipated. Even countries like Italy banned ChatGPT in 2023. I think a lot of people forget that. So there was a lot of rushing to respond, and then some paring back and some more thoughtful deliberation. So you had maybe around only 100 artificial intelligence bills that were filed in 2023. In 2024, it's advanced a little more. You have more competitors on the scene like Anthropic and Google Gemini and GPT-4 at that point.
Yeah, Grok was out there, I think, right?
And Grok. Yeah, exactly. XAI is on the scene, and there's even more competitors that don't get a lot of attention. But you had almost all the states, I think 45 states filed over 700 bills on AI in 2024. And the only ones that didn't were the ones that weren't in session, like Montana, Texas, Nevada. So had they been in session, I'm sure they would have. Then you're into this year, it's really, especially with J.D. Vance's remarks in Europe, kind of reframing this more as a national security imperative and launching the competitive nature of the AI race. You've now had all 50 states file legislation. At this point, a lot of debate about bias and discrimination, but also how do we incentivize the responsible development of AI? And there's a couple of current events I think we're going to talk about later on in this discussion, but a great place to start is what Utah did, which was establish an Office of AI Policy that's internal to their Department of Commerce, that's meant to be that in-house expertise and resource that informs the government and the legislature on how we ought to be thinking about and regulating artificial intelligence with the eye on innovation, not regulating to favor a specific industry or the another or to dictate specific outcomes. But again, how do we proactively put some reasonable guardrails on the development and use of the tech while still fostering innovation? So that's a great model policy that once Utah passed that in 2024, ALEC has a Model State Artificial Intelligence Act that encourages the first step for any legislator at the federal or state level.
Yeah, no, it's been great in what they've been doing there. And I think so far in 2025, there's more like 1,000 bills that are related to AI, right?
We crossed 1,000, and I think some of the resources tracking the legislation moving, they've seen only 100, or few of them have actually crossed the finish lines. There's a lot of ideas circulating around, which is healthy exchange of ideas again. And states as the laboratory of democracy is really important. That Illinois can try an idea, and it's not going to affect citizens in Louisiana or Georgia or Virginia. Yeah. So I think that's healthy debate. And then there's also the other important thing to note is there was this conversation about a federal moratorium on state AI laws that ultimately did not pass in the big, beautiful bill, but it jolted a lot of conversation at the state level. Yeah. Even Governor Jared Polis of Colorado expressed support for the idea of a moratorium. Yeah. Instead of having 50 states having their own different AI frameworks. But again, like we mentioned earlier, Congress unfortunately has proven they haven't been able to act on this yet. And some were skeptical about the idea of should we preempt without a federal solution? Yeah.
And it's interesting because I want to dig into that a little bit more, Jake. But we've had these other examples of bills that have passed, like Colorado passed one on AI, regulating AI to a certain extent. And, even Jared Polis, to your point, the governor there was kind of hesitant and brought up some key points being like, look, this isn't necessarily the best that I think we should do or what we should do, but I'm going to go ahead and sign the bill so we can work on it later. And then I think they're in a special session right now talking about this. And so it's nice to see them coming back to this, but we've also seen California put out some pretty bad legislation. Connecticut put out some pretty bad legislation on AI and the amount of regulation, the political bias that's involved. And it really brings in the question of what exactly are they trying to do? And it seems to me like, and by the way, in Texas, where I live, there was what's called TREGA, which I've talked about on the show before, but basically the Texas Responsibility AI Act, Governance Act, and it started off pretty bad overall. There was a lot of political bias and other things that were in there as part of the bill, heavy-handed of regulation. I think we got into a better place with these laboratories that are in there that allow some more freedom, like sandboxes and stuff like that. Not as far, it's not as free market as what I would like, but at least it was better than where it started. But to your point, we have seen these different bills come up. And do we want the direction of AI legislation to be Colorado and Illinois and California and New York, those sort of places? Or do we want it to be more of the Florida, Tennessee, Texas, and other places like that? It really brings up this dichotomy. And I think that's why it became so important about this state AI or this AI moratorium for states by Congress in the One Big Beautiful Bill because of the differences that are going on. But I think as more conservatives, right, classical liberals, usually the idea is that government's best that's closer to the people. And so you want this competition to happen, but there was a push including me and others that are out there, right, that were saying, well, no, we need this moratorium. My argument is that for one thing, the government closest to the people is actually the individual. It's not the local government, in my view, it's the individual. And so they should have access to information to be able to make the decisions on their own versus trying to localize even to the state on what the regulations should be. You know what I mean? But there was also this question about, well, should Congress come in and do something? But you also have interstate commerce that's happening with AI across the country and things of that nature. And so maybe there is a reason for Congress to act. But what have been some of your thoughts on this, Jake, and what you've heard from some of your members, pro and con, that might help others to think about this?
Yes, I'll start with just breaking down some of the issues that I see with some of these bias and discrimination bills.
Yes.
So you mentioned what Colorado enacted into law, and I believe they remain the only state that have actually enacted this into law. The intention is pretty good on its face if you think about it. They want to protect consumers in their state from an AI tool either somehow illegally discriminating against them if they're applying for housing or if they're applying for a job or if they're trying to sign up for energy services. You know, I think in your Texas bill, for instance, there were like 14 specific categories of areas where an AI can't discriminate. But here's where the issue is they're putting the onus on the developers of the technology. In this case, that's the AI makers like ChatGPT or Google or Anthropic. And they've really developed these generative AI tools as general purpose tools. You know, they're not in OpenAI isn't developing ChatGPT to be a resume screening system first and foremost necessarily. It's a general purpose tool. If you ask it a question, it's going to try and give you an answer to the best that it can. It's a predictive text tool. Now, unfortunately, what's happening is these rules in Colorado and that have been advanced in places like Connecticut and Virginia and have failed. They're trying to blame the developers of the technology for the error and not the actual person committing the harm, you know, not the person doing the bad conduct. So, you know, if you purchase a hammer from a hardware store and you commit a crime with that, you aren't suing the hammer company. You know, you go after the person actually committing the harmful conduct. And then you mentioned interstate commerce concerns. Like in that respect, if that was what we were doing, was blaming the people who committed the bad conduct, I think enforcement at the state level would make a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
But now if you're talking about regulating these national or multinational companies for inadvertent conduct that happens in one particular state, then you get into these weird interstate commerce boundaries here. So I think, unfortunately, and this is what's happening in places like Colorado, is that law is supposed to take effect in February of 2026. And they tried this session. It was a priority of the governor and the legislature to convene a task force to fix the bill. To your point, Governor Polis only signed it under the condition that they would go back and fix it later, and they were unable to do so. So now the clock is ticking, and then they have this brief opportunity with the special session later in September to fix it, or they're going to have to deal with it first order of business in January, because they're hearing from businesses in Colorado this is so onerous and are going to have all these negative, unexpected consequences that aren't even on the AI companies you're trying to regulate. Sometimes AI is defined so broadly in these bills, it's going to apply to things like search engines or spreadsheets or just any kind of software that you're using, even like Zoom or other technologies that just happen to use AI and automation. So it's I think that's why you've seen it not advance in places like Connecticut and California even, that are deep blue states, but their business community is really highlighting the consequences.
Yeah, definitely. Great points there, Jake. I want to stick with AI for a little bit because it builds on some other things that's going on. And, you know, you and I've had some conversations about this and some with others and groups. And one of the points that I think has been that was good to me, to kind of like this aha moment, is to think about AI more as like advanced computing. It's been with us for a long time in different capacities, and people think about it as being new and they're kind of scared about it. And that's how we've been in each sort of revolution, whether it be the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, post-industrial revolution, and so forth. I kind of think that the AI revolution is something that's going to dramatically change our economy and our lives. I think it will be better. I'm optimistic about it. There will always be hiccups along the way and some costs that will happen, of course, and we've got to be aware of those. But I do think it will help to improve our lives as humans as we move forward. And I know that for me, Jake, that AI has been something that I use all the time. I mean, I use GPS in my car whenever I go from one place to another. That's a form of AI. Whenever you've looked at something on Google search, it's a form of AI. These are things that have been part of us. It just seems like right now, maybe some people, are a little worried about the Terminator sort of situation, or who is behind the AI, that their assumptions may not be exactly what we want, or could be bad, or put us in a wrong direction that could really influence things. I think about Iron Man, right? And those sort of stuff that's going on. And that stuff can be scary, but I also think it was really important what J.D. Vance said, to your point, whenever he was in Europe earlier this year, to say that if we don't compete, China is going to continue to go in this direction. And then if they come up with stuff that we can't compete with or we can't counter, then we're going to be falling behind. And so, in fact, this sort of fear-mongering could be pushing us into more regulation, lack of innovation that actually makes us worse off, which is in a worse situation than had we continued to innovate and come up with new ideas. What are your thoughts on that, Jake?
Well, one thing that's great to see is we have strong leadership from the top at the White House that are now encouraging and supporting this technology. One of the first things President Trump did when he came back into office was rescind President Biden's AI executive order. It was a 100-plus page executive order that was really, there were some good things about it, but in general was setting us on the wrong trajectory. Instead, his administration recently just put out an AI action plan that leaves a lot of the finer details up to Congress and states to really get us there, but again is a more encouraging message about how do we make sure the U.S. stays in the lead, not only in AI, but other emerging tech. And then the other thing, too, is about, what states can do. There are some solutions, like I mentioned before, about the bias and discrimination conversation. Yeah. There's plenty of existing law in the United States that can handle these disputes. A lot of these consumer protection laws, they're intentionally designed to be broad and not tied to one specific technology, and those statutes are more than up to the task. If there's discriminatory or unfair or illegal conduct happening, it doesn't matter if you're using an AI tool. You're still committing a crime and should be prosecuted to the full extent. Yeah. And one example of this is the situation with deepfake images and recordings. So that continues to be a massive issue that everyday citizens are concerned about. Whether you're being impersonated on a phone call, that's pretending to be your CEO asking you to buy gift cards, or your mom saying that I'm in trouble and you just Venmo me some money. Right. That's a real issue that's impacting hundreds or thousands of people every day as these impersonations and scams get better. But states have actually reformed a lot of their laws to account for digital replicas and for deepfakes. That if someone's impersonating you, it's still prosecuting under the law, and if it can either through the existing civil court system, or again, if it's in the case of child sex abuse material and revenge pornography, any kind of criminal avenues should still be open. Yeah. And law enforcement still remains an issue that is, they're very understaffed and underfunded. So that's another thing that we should be looking at is how to modernize law enforcement and make sure they have all the tools they need to keep criminals at bay. Yeah. So I think we can do both. You can have the optimistic message encouraging the use of AI responsibly and ethically and morally, while also cracking down on illegal behavior and fraudulent behavior that everybody agrees is wrong.
So when we look at age verification, and whether it's on the platform level or on the app level, the Google Play versus the Apple Store, you get all these different things. In Texas, they regulate it at the platform level, and that can be helpful. And you can just click one button instead of having to go through each app as a parent to figure out what your kids are going to be on and what they're seeing. However, it puts a lot more liability or responsibility on the platforms whenever they're just allowing for these businesses, each one of these apps, to run on their platform. And so then that can create some other issues that are out there. And it also, at the end of the day, takes away some of the responsibility of parents to be insightful about what's on each one of the apps and what's happening at the end of the day. And so I've been very cautious about, or really against, doing it at the platform level, or really a lot of the age verification, because we may not know what the future is going to hold, Jake. I mean, going back to economics and Hayek and even Thomas Sowell and his good book, Knowledge and Decisions, we don't have the knowledge. The politicians don't have the knowledge in order to come up with the best solution, best policy right now compared to otherwise. And these kids are likely to be in a much different. I mean, I can't even imagine what's going to be in 10 years, but I can't imagine that we're still on the computer. They're still using phones, all these apps. And what happens if we keep them from getting into the future and use these apps wisely? Because now they've had no access to it until a certain year if they choose not to, right. Or these rules force them not to, that sets them up to not having as much of a productive career in the future. Do you think I'm off base there, or kind of what's your view about what's going on with this age verification regulations?
I think you're very apt to notice that it's going to continue to evolve from here. And I see the next level of this conversation has to do with AI and kids' safety online. You're already seeing a lot of attention to, I believe it was last year, there was the character.ai platform, and there was this tragic story that came out of the New York Times of a child who was using that platform, and it was purported that by talking with the bot, it helped encourage the child to end their life, which is horrifying to hear. And again, there's kind of questions about, did character.ai do enough to not allow the platform to respond to that kind of query? But like we were talking about earlier with the bias and discrimination stuff, is if you as the user willingly circumvent those safeguards that the company spent so long to put in place and try and jailbreak the software, essentially, should the company be responsible for that? I mean, I'm not quite sure. I think it's kind of an open question at this point. But I think you're going to continue to see this as, people are worried, parents and policymakers are concerned about, should AI be used in kids settings like in K through 12 education or with, kids specific AI applications. To your point, I think it's very important that kids be introduced to these skills early, and they're going to be expected to use them the second they exit the school system and enter the workforce, whether that's a blue collar profession or a white collar profession. They're going to be expected to master these tools, and if they don't, again, the Chinese and other workforces across the world are picking up this technology and will beat us at our own game. So I think there can be a balance. I tend to caution legislators and policymakers against outright bans of the technology. Again, it kind of misses the forest for the trees. Some children, you might have a very responsible 12-year-old kid who you're okay letting them get on, a platform or a game. And others, maybe they can't be trusted. Maybe they won't be doing their homework if they're on a game all night. And maybe they need a little bit more supervision. That should be up to the parent to decide. The parents and the caregivers in the home and the teachers, to some extent, that see them every day, they're the ones that know that best, not a school administrator, not a state legislator, and certainly not in DC. But you do have some regulations being suggested at the state level and the federal level, like the Kids Online Safety Act, that have gotten some traction. I think you had 97 senators vote yes on that. When can you get 97 senators to agree on anything these days? So clearly I think that's the next step of this conversation, is AI and kids safety.
Yeah, definitely. I think too, Jake, whenever I'm looking at this, is one for the audience is, if there is age verification for a minor, which is what some of these states are doing, like Texas, it also means age verification for everyone who is not a minor, that we have to give them information. And so there's also, from a conservative viewpoint, I think about, how much information am I having to share with these private companies? And in the bills that they're creating, it says they can only have it for 24 hours or 48 hours. I mean, it's supposed to be really short term, but how often has things went south when we've given up our information for credit card scams and other things? And so I think that's another concern I know that I have and other people have that I want to be careful about. Let's move on to another key issue that I know you've been writing about and that's out there is, we often hear about digital equity and broadband expansion. And there's been different bills, especially during the Biden administration, that would have expanded broadband. There's been bills in the states to basically have to close this digital divide, really between urban areas and rural areas. Urban areas have the digital broadband and everything, whereas the rural areas don't. How do we ensure that closing the digital divide doesn't mean growing a new kind of dependency on government while still helping those who currently don't have access to it? How do we make sure that they still have it?
It's a great question, Vance. And so to the point that internet connectivity is so essential to life these days, whether you like technology or not, it is becoming more and more essential every day. And part of what has allowed that to flourish is the fact that it's private sector led. And, in the United States, it's private companies like Comcast, Verizon, Fios, AT&T and the cell companies. They are private entities that have built out that infrastructure responding to market forces. And that's gotten us most of the way there. You have, I think, well over 90% of the U.S. has access to high-speed internet at this point. The only places that don't have it at this point are, very rural, remote locations or areas that might be difficult to build out. So like maybe in Florida, there might be some areas that are more marshy, swampish terrain where it's harder to build the fiber in the ground, or a very mountainous terrain in places like Alaska where it's just harder again and more cost intensive. So that was the proposition that the Biden administration, and I think it was in the infrastructure law, where they set aside this $42 billion investment that was supposed to be, this is it. This will finally get the United States 100% connected, just like electrification back in the 1900s. And that was going to do it. But then they kind of got in their own way, and they just couldn't help themselves by adding these requirements, preferencing union labor, preferencing, different climate change provisions, or even some rate regulation, mandating that you have a certain low cost tier, which again is very anti-market forces. That is what's allowed the companies to turn a profit and operate successfully. So you did have, and then after all of that, they had like 4 years into implementation, still not one home has been connected by that program, which is a travesty.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the Trump administration now is reversing some of those mandates that they put on states should they be implementing that money. So hopefully, once they've had an opportunity to readjust their plans, that money can finally start flowing responsibly, and we can get that build out underway and start connecting some homes.
Yeah. It's always funny, Jake. We have these good ideas. Like Milton Friedman, one of my favorite economists, he always said, "Don't judge a policy by its intentions, but by its results." And so there's likely great intentions for what should be done here, but the results haven't shown up yet. I mean, especially from those restrictions that you said from that money, $40+ billion of taxpayer money. It also brings that somebody who's a fiscal hawk. Why are we spending money on this? And I think, this has been a question for me that I've been wrestling with, Jake, is, should the government be putting in broadband in places that it's currently not, for a couple of reasons. One reason is in those marshy places, or in the mountains, or in the vast West Texas, where it's very rural. Some of these people live there, so they don't have to be so connected with urban areas. And now we're trying to force them to have this broadband and high-speed internet and everything else. And it's almost like, to the people like me who don't live in those places, hey, I'm paying for that now. Why should my taxpayer dollars be used to run that out there? I think there was some question about this, Jake, with like COVID and the lockdowns and the education being online. But I'm like, we should never have shutdowns again. I don't want to go through any of that. Instead of preparing for that, how about let's just not shut things down? The other question to me is that, private sector tends to work best. And so when we have this money, we're also going to be giving it to certain providers. And so then you can have some cronyism that takes place of where those dollars are going. And then finally, I don't know that we're always going to need broadband wires. Like Starlink and some of these other innovations that are coming out now may make all this obsolete. I don't know what do you think about some of those, Jake?
Yeah. So what I've heard and what I understand about the telecom industry is that fiber optic broadband, fiber broadband in the ground is still a future-proof investment. Okay. From what I understand. It's going to be the best option for a while. But like you mentioned, new technologies have emerged on the scene. You have satellite internet by Starlink and Viasat and other providers that's getting better and more reliable and can deliver matching or fair, certainly better than zero metrics. Yeah. So can we, if you're in a rural community, instead of spending tens of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars to connect just a handful of homes with fiber, why not allow them Starlink to connect those homes for a fraction of the cost? And even with wireless technologies, the wireless companies like Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, they offer something called fixed wireless access, which is essentially through cell towers, you can deliver home internet, similar to how satellite works. But that's another option where, instead of just wiring directly to people's homes, you can have fixed wireless delivering high-speed internet access just as good or at least competitive with fiber.
Yeah.
So that's good that allows market competition to work, right? Because you have fiber competing with fixed wireless, competing with satellite for business. And ALEC's recommendation is that if you can satisfy the FCC's requirement for broadband, then there shouldn't be any preferencing of one technology or the other. It should be an open competition, and those providers need to be bidding the states as to why they need to receive that federal money. And the other issue is when governments or cities directly try and compete with the private sector through government-owned broadband networks. A city might decide upon themselves, we want to treat internet service like a utility and create our own, city of wherever broadband network. And what's unfortunately happened, some great work has been done at places like the Taxpayers Protection Alliance to really study the results of these government-owned networks. Very often they go way over budget, they underdeliver, and sometimes they even just go completely out of business, leaving taxpayers on the hook for this infrastructure that didn't even deliver results.
Yeah.
So end of the day, market competition is still the best solution. Maybe we need some government investment to connect those truly rural areas where the market hasn't worked. But by and large, we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, good points, man. Well, speaking of cities, you've also spoken about smart cities and helped launch a caucus on the Hill around that. And so how can states and local governments effectively integrate technology while respecting privacy and individual freedom? And what's going on there with these smart cities?
Yeah, that was a really fun initiative to launch when I was back on Capitol Hill in Darrell Issa's office. We partnered with Representative Yvette Clark's office to launch a bipartisan caucus on the Hill on smart cities and smart communities. This was back, I think, in 2018, 2017.
Okay.
So it's amazing to see even how far that has grown.
Yeah.
Because now you have companies like Waymo and Tesla, trying to offer autonomous rides and services. Even Uber and Lyft were the disruptors, and now you have Waymo coming in, competing with them. So it's really fascinating to see.
Yeah.
And part of it, just being frank about it, I think there was some overpromising there. Like, I feel like we thought maybe by 2025 we'd be way in the future, and there'd be all these autonomous drones and package delivery, and some of that is starting to happen. It's already starting to happen with like food delivery. Sometimes if you're in a small apartment complex or something, you might have some autonomous food delivery or package delivery. So it's happening, and Waymo is expanding to more and more cities across the U.S. But it's a prime area for state legislators to get involved, because a lot of things like road regulations, and that's directly the domain of states. And they can really make the difference as to whether they're encouraging this technology. Like Arizona and the Phoenix metro area in particular have been welcoming these companies with open arms to test their products. Even Texas, for instance, they've allowed a company called Aurora Technologies to test their autonomous trucking. I think they have a route, it might be between Dallas and Houston, where they can test these autonomous trucks. And the state is supportive of that. And I think they have to report some certain information to the state. But that's a great model instead of what California attempted to do a few years ago, which was ban autonomous trucking or require there to be a human driver in the vehicle at all times. But I think even Governor Newsom, I believe he vetoed that or opposed that law. But I think there will continue to be that tension as far as how and whether autonomous vehicles should be used. But again, market forces at work, and states can choose to be either the leader in this technology, or maybe they're falling behind.
Yeah, no, great points. And, I live near Austin, and so Waymo is all over the place in downtown Austin these days. And so it's interesting to see all these different dynamics that are happening, and the pushback and everything else that's going on. And as we're wrapping up now, Jake, and it's been a great conversation, it does look like there are some opportunities, also some challenges for the future. I think it's important that I try to put out there is, look, I'm a free market economist, maybe one of the most as you can come. Like, I'm pretty far out there, man. And but I do think it's important for us to note the challenges that people will likely face. Like, some people are likely to lose their job that they have currently because of AI. For example, with your point just right there on autonomous trucks, on big 18-wheelers and things of that nature, you could put some of them out of a job. And there's a lot of concern about that when you go talk to grassroots and everyone else and legislators, of course, because they're hearing it from their constituents. And so it's a real concern. But one thing that I've tried to bring up, Jake, is that during other types of revolutions and massive turnover and changes, there have been different jobs that have come up. Like when T-Model Ford was coming around, we were on horse and buggy. And so when you go from horse and buggy to a car, yes, we're going to lose some of those people who are working in the horse and buggy industry, but now many of them would go into the car industry and make more money and not have to work as hard or as be in a safer environment in many cases. And the same thing I think is happening now. Now, if I say, well, yeah, but you can find a new job, people are going to be like, oh man, well, how am I going to do that? And so I do think that there are going to need to be some real good lessons learned, and for policymakers to be thinking about this through portable benefits and other ideas that are out there. But what say you? Like, what have you been hearing and thinking and researching on in this space?
I think it's very important not to discount those concerns, and they are real concerns. One thing I will point out is I'm going to refer to something that Illinois just did, was they passed a novel law banning the use of AI therapy in the state of Illinois. So that was, I imagine that was largely the effort of probably licensed psychologists or psychiatrists who they see innovation and they see how some of these AI tools can be used for therapy. And I think if you look at some of the research, like it's one of the common applications of even ChatGPT and Google Gemini's. People just want companionship with these AI tools, and they feel like they can trust an AI tool to tell it something they may not want to tell a human, which I think that could actually be beneficial in the medical setting. Maybe there's some information a person would be hesitant to trust with their doctor or with their physician just because that's a human on the other side. They feel like they're going to be judged, but then they could confide in kind of an anonymous chatbot, maybe. So, but unfortunately, what Illinois has done is they just decided, no, even if you're a licensed clinician, you cannot use AI for specific therapy purposes. You pretty much can use it for paperwork and note taking, but even supplemental cases really restricted how you can use AI. Utah, on the other hand, they passed a law earlier this year that's more focused on transparency and disclosure. So if a therapist is going to be using an AI tool with you, they have to disclose that and make sure the patient is aware of that. And it also allows a safe harbor in the law that if a company is going to be providing a service like this, if they can attest to the state that they're fulfilling these various requirements, then they're going to be shielded from liability in the law if they're acting in good faith. That's a much better way to go.
Yeah.
But back to the larger conversation, I think that's where you're seeing some of these Illinois efforts come from is, certain industries feel threatened, understandably so, that their lives are going to be disrupted. And to your point, I feel like people sometimes in the technology space used to just say, "Oh, learn to code, that's the future." And then now the coders are being disrupted, right? Now the office workers like myself, some of my work might be replaced by AI.
Mine too, man.
Mine too. It's going to affect everybody.
Yeah.
And it's gonna require some serious effort. And again, maybe the appropriate role for the government to provide resources or maybe some continuing education options to help, and make sure that there is a pathway forward. But I don't think it's as easy as just saying learn to code. And that's, frankly, people don't respond very well to that anymore.
No.
But more to come. To your point, I'm excited for the opportunities in the future. I think kids are going to need to learn to use AI. They can create their own applications and their own products, even more so using AI today.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, it's been a great conversation, Jake. Thank you so much. And where are some of the best places to find you and your information and more about ALEC?
Yes, so please visit our website, alec.org, ALEC.org. You can find all of our technology-related work at the Communications and Technology Task Force. We have, I believe it's 6 model policies on our website on artificial intelligence that are a great place for any state legislator or elected official or just policy. If you're just interested in policy, check out our website. And we cover more than just technology. Yeah. We cover tax, education, healthcare, the whole gamut.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks again, Jake, for being on the program and all the great work that you're doing. It's really fantastic. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for being on, and God bless you and your family.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jake. Well, for the audience, thank you for joining us today. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you're not as nervous or scared about AI if you were going into this. There's still a lot of things that need to be discussed and researched and learned in the process, but a lot of it goes back to you, to me. We've got to learn to figure out how to deal with the future however we can, because we have it in our hands in much of capacity, whether it's our kids or otherwise. We've got a lot to learn. So I appreciate you joining us on this Let People Prosper show today. And until next time, God bless you and let people prosper.